Here's how world wars happen. Vague red lines. So when you don't know what somebody's actual red lines are, then you accidentally end up doing things that cross somebody's red line without knowing it. So my view is the U.S. has operated according to this model of strategic ambiguity. I think we need strategic clarity. Be crystal clear and mean it. As I said, if you hit us, including our sons and daughters who are troops, stationed wherever they are, we will hit you, not some other vague other actor. We will hit you 10 times harder. That's a clear red line. That's how you avoid world wars. Now, I think the other thing you got to look at is it my job to be a global policeman? If so, that's a clear path to world war because you have conflicts that don't relate to your self-interest. Or is it my path only to look after my self-interest? So if you start with the first premise that it's in every nation's self-interest to avoid world war and every nation is only acting in their self-interest, then you avoid that world war scenario. So now let's get really specific. What are the series of events that could lead us here? One thing we're doing right now that increases the risk of world war is that our policies are driving Russia further into China's hands. And in order to have a world war, what you need is at least two different superpowers, neither of whom can obviously prevail in victory over another one. I think that the U.S. vis-a-vis China alone or the U.S. vis-a-vis Russia alone actually is objectively going to be stronger than each alone. But if Russia and China are allied, as we're forcing them to be, and I'll explain how, then they could arguably outmatch the United States because Russia has nuclear capacity ahead of that of the U.S. Russia has hypersonic missile capabilities ahead of the U.S. What is hypersonic missile? Travel faster than the speed of sound, carrying potential nuclear loads that could hit the United States. China's naval capacity is arguably ahead of that of the United States, and we then depend on China's economy for our modern way of life. And so China and Russia are already in an alliance with one another, but we're driving Russia further into China's hands. How? By isolating Russia economically, so they need more China. If we've cut off the West, they need to actually depend on China economically. How? We're arming Ukraine to the teeth to fight Russia. That's why China's arming Ukraine. That's why China's then arming Russia. Again, driving them further into China's hands militarily. Economically and militarily, the policies we have adopted are driving Russia further into its military alliance with China. We made a commitment. James Baker, the U.S. Secretary of State, did in 1990 to Gorbachev, who led the USSR, that NATO would expand not 1 inch. It's like Ronald McDaniel's not 1 cent commitment to me. Not 1 inch past East Germany. Well, we haven't kept that. NATO's expanded more after the fall of the USSR than it has ever after. Again, then encircling Russia, or at least from Putin's perception, driving then further into a need for military alliance with China. So that's the number one precipitating factor here is the Russia-China alliance that raises the risk of World War III. And then if you combine that with these vague rules of proxy war, right? The vague rules of proxy war are, well, we're saying in the Middle East that if somebody pays a group to hit somebody who's allied with us, that gives us the right to preemptively hit them. If we do that and act on that, that automatically is then Russia's justification for doing the same in return to us. And then if I'm U.S. president, I have to stick to my principle, because if you hit us, I will hit you back 10 times harder, whoever you are, and I will always keep that. Well, then we hit Russia 10 times harder than they hit us. That's World War right there, allied with China. And by the way, the wild card in all of this is you have nuclear weapons involved. We had the first nuclear non-proliferation agreement that's absent. It's the first time we've had no nuclear non-proliferation agreement between the U.S. and Russia since the early 1970s. And then China's sitting here when we're wearing thin in Ukraine and the Middle East to go after Taiwan, which is in our vital interest. So again, here I've done something that no other presidential candidate has. I'm clear. We will defend Taiwan. That's different than the U.S. policy in both parties right now, which is strategic ambiguity. I think we need strategic clarity. Draw that red line. We will defend Taiwan at least until, for the foreseeable future, at least until we have achieved semiconductor independence. Because if China's squatting on the semiconductor supply chain, then they have an economic gun to our head. You can't be using that phone, that computer, that camera, these lights. We have to depend on China and ask them for permission.
Yeah, one company, TSMC is a linchpin until all of the chip fabs get built in the United States and the brain power that's going to be designing those chips are back in the United States.
Or at least in Korea and Japan and the United States.
Yeah, if you look at the market share of global reliance, Taiwan is the most overweight in any industry you could ever lay out.
Totally. And it's sad that we got to where we are, but we are where we are. And so my view is that then becomes a precipitating factor because, again, it's strategic vagueness, right? China doesn't know what we're going to do. Versus if you say outright, no, you do not do this for the foreseeable future, at least until we're semiconductor independent. And after that, we will resume our current position of strategic ambiguity. A current position, resume it later. This is how you avoid World War III. And I'm deeply worried that we have, and I know that was a lot going on there. And so, there's a lot of different factors and foreign policy is complicated. And I understand why the likes of the neocon hawks like Nikki Haley would say, I feel dumber every time you speak. Yep, I understand you can't process all of that because you want to go to war and make money and put more money in your bank account as a consequence of it. I get that. That's fine. That's why these people should never come within spitting distance of the White House. But we are closer to World War III than we have ever been in any of our lifetimes in this room, of those of us who are in this room. And I think that requires a president who at least states that as a commitment and has a clear vision of how to do it.